Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru, Republic Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, Honduras, Guyana, Brazil, Guatemala, Venezuela, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, Bahamas, Tobacco, Samoa, there's Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, Germany now, One Piece, Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Turkey, and Greece, Poland, Romania, Scotland, Albania, Ireland, Russia, Oman, Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Cyprus, Iraq, and Iran. There's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Yemen, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, Portugal, France, the Denmark, Spain, there's India, Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, Thailand, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Egypt, China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Somalia, Portugal, Vietnam, Tunisia, Iraq, Uganda, and Botswana, Mozambique, and there we go. There's Burundi, Somalia, Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, China, Egypt, Nepal, Tanzania, Somalia, Kenya, Sierra, Nigeria, Namibia, Senegal, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Guinea, Sudan, Rwanda, Mauritania, Hong Kong, Yugoslavia, Mauritania, Romania, Bangladesh, and Montenegro, Sudan. Thank you very much.
È fantastica Narmane Galmalotrat. Who cares about how the days go forth? They'll go on as they wish. Brother, in 100 years more, you will no longer exist. Then someone else will have taken your place. You'll know nothing of it. You'll feel no rain, no sun down in that space, deep in your dark sealed pit. Who cares about how the nights do pace? I couldn't really care, as long as I can keep my face buried in my love's hand. Jag har en tvivelaktig glor, du kan mycket till. Behind the corner, death does linger. He'll come when he wants his kill.
Well, good evening, everyone. And we are getting ready. Welcome to Environmental Coffee House. I am Sandy Shellis, and welcome, Dr. Jeremy Jimenez. I am very excited to have you with me. This is awesome. Guys, welcome tonight. This is really, really good for me. I know Jeremy. Dr. Jimenez is from SUNY Cortland, and I was at SUNY Buff State, so we are compadres in our SUNY schools.
My SUNY sister.
My SUNY brother. And you are actually a professor, which I was not. I was a professional administrator, and you got your PhD in international comparative education from Stanford, that's pretty damn cool. So why don't you take it away and tell us a little about you without me having to tell everybody about you?
So I've been a professor up here for a couple years. I chose this place both to kind of be near my family, but not so near. Also because I like this program. I like what I teach. It's mostly a teacher training program, so it kind of has like that really big impact. Like, one thing is you're teaching this class of students, but if you're teaching your teacher, like, you're in theory teaching all the students they're going to have throughout their career, right? So it's like, it gives a lot of motivation to be really invested in it. And of course, upstate New York, like Sandy knows, Sandy's always trying to recruit people up here. It's one of the few, perhaps few habitable zones of the world in the decades ahead. So it's a good place to escape the heat waves, although we're getting one maybe next week, but so far it hasn't been too bad. But yeah, so I've always been somewhat involved in education. I haven't really had any non-education job. I was a substitute teacher, and then I was a high school history economics teacher, And then I got my PhD in education, and that's when I became a professor. And so yeah, I taught a couple places around the
Nice.
world. I taught in Venezuela for a few years. I did a Fulbright scholar grant in Norway, teaching in Norwegian
That's
high schools.
impressive, by the way. Fulbright is nothing to scoff at. Mm-mm.
Yeah, and that was a pretty soon. It's called the
Mm-mm.
Roving Scholar Program. So I got to actually every week go to a
Oh.
different town in Norway and travel the entire length of the country. In fact, one time I was like
Ooh.
traveling so much, they called Norway has so much money from oil. So they once
Oh, yeah.
called me in to talk about my spending. They're like, we're a little concerned. You've been traveling a lot, da-da. And they weren't concerned I was traveling too much. They were concerned that the other rovers weren't traveling enough and
Oh,
they weren't going to meet their budget. So they're like, since the other rovers aren't
no.
traveling so much, maybe you could like take an extra flight, take an extra, go to Svalbard, go somewhere. And so, yeah, so that was a great year. Um,
Wow.
and yeah.
Well, I'm impressed. And I know, yeah, Norway, they have a lot of money because they may use green energy, but they certainly don't drill it.
Nope,
Nope.
exactly. It is
Nope.
a wonderful welfare state, but brought to you by the petroleum for sure. Yeah.
There you go. And I know that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight is your viewpoints on said petroleum and green energy and sustainability. And you're going to tell us about how you got to be, or at least pick up where you left off with Collapse Chronicles. Marvelous interview with Sam Mitchell, telling us about how you got hooked into the letter, which I think was because Jem Bendel had put his feelers out for that. And you're amongst some really great company there, Peter Kalmus and a lot of other, William Reese. So let us hear a little bit about that. And then your travels. Then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes.
Okay, so you want me to kind of give my sort of big talk first, and then we'll talk travel?
Oh, it's up to you. It's your show.
Okay, yeah,
Whatever
all right.
floats your boat.
Well, yeah, having someone regularly watch your show, I was trying to think, what are something I could talk about that's like not already been discussed at length and kind of mix things up. Like, what new could I add to the conversation? And so, what I came up with was thinking about how we make generalizations about humanity, like based on our daily experience with humans in agro-industrial society, and assuming that's how humans have always been.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to argue we can consider there's basically four sort of broad views people have of humanity. And if you've seen my recent Collapse Chronicles interview, you'll find no hopium smoker here. But that said, one of the few things I am positive
Doomer
about.
adjacent.
Doomer adjacent, yeah.
Dr.
Watch the
Doomer
interview if you want to know
adjacent.
what Doomer adjacent means. Is however short our lives may end up being, I still think they can be improved by learning from Indigenous perspectives. So today I'm going to talk about, I'll start and end there with the first one being the kind of the Indigenous view, which is like humans as part of their local ecosystem, no better, no worse. Okay. So for like the roughly 300,000 years we've been a species, we've been mostly hunter-gatherers, which required us to be intimately connected with our local natural bioregion. We've mostly hunted wild herbivores, but we've still respected them as beings. We'd honor and teach about them with cave paintings, and in killing them, we'd express gratitude in various ways, telling the spirit of the animal, thank you for feeding my community, and when I die, my body will return healthy nutrients to the soil and nourish it, thus feeding and nourishing your kin. Now, the anthropologists Graeber and Wengrow in their recent book, Dawn of Humanity, challenged a long-held assumption that hunter-gatherers were people that had yet to discover agriculture, right? That they just weren't advanced enough. They share many examples where indigenous communities either dabbled in farming only seasonally, or have some deep dove into it only to find it to be like fundamentally destabilizing, both socially and ecologically. And they were like, screw this, not worth it, let's go back to hunting gathering. But for reasons I'll soon explain, eventually long-term agriculture became the primary form of social organization, which was our first big step from seeing ourselves as part of a natural ecosystem. So full-time farming slowly brought us to view number 2. Humans are special, and we're the best species. Now, some scholars such as Daniel Schmachtenberger and Robert Jensen have talked about how this view of supremacy became especially prominent since the advent of the plow, which pushes us from being part of an ecosystem to we humans are superior and animals are our servants. I think best exemplified by the biblical notion, man has dominion over the animals. Before permanent agricultural societies, men would be more likely to bring home wild animal calories and women more likely to supply forage calories, and maybe they both dabbled a bit in horticulture. The plow, however, removed women from being an equal contributor to their community's food needs because it was mostly men that had the testosterone-driven upper body strength to push a plow. And even if women did have enough strength to use it, they risked having a miscarriage if they did. And since being settled meant the more children, the better, because it meant more males to push the plow and fight in the army, and more females to birth more future children. And since now men's testosterone elevated their societal importance as plow pushers and war fodder, they begin to take control of communities and begin to view women's value primarily, if not exclusively, as breeders. Thus, we slowly shift from earlier decentralized matrilineal systems and mother goddesses to patriarchal control systems and male tyrant deities. And so, along with adopting this view, number two comes pride and arrogance in the supposed human supremacy, which fundamentally shifts our appreciation of being embedded in a complex ecosystem to human ingenuity, giving us the power to manipulate nature to serve human supremacy. Now, if many hunter-gatherers were like, screw this whole farmer thing, how did most of the world end up as settled farmers? Well, once a particular community chose to become settled, they became a serious threat to their hunter-gatherer neighbors. And food surpluses enabled continual growth to go from village to town to city to empire. As these agricultural empires expanded further into where indigenous hunter-gatherers were living, these indigenous communities had three choices. One, they could resist, in which case they'd probably be conquered and incorporated and maybe even enslaved. Two, they could join them, becoming settled themselves, build up their own surpluses of food, and maybe at first just say is to be defensive, but eventually when big enough, become aggressive as well. Or they could flee, which was usually to the lands that were not easily settled, high in the mountains, deep in the rainforest, in wide, dry grasslands unsuitable for intensive farming, which is where today, consequently, many of our few remaining indigenous communities live. And I'll come back later to talk about the descendants of people who lived in those communities.
Okay.
And so over time, as society shifted from indigenous to larger settled communities, another very important cultural shift happened: the increasing presence of narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths. Now, there is some overlap and differences between these labels. Psychologists still debate the nature-nurture aspects of them, but what's most important for our purposes is what they have in common. They all lack empathy, and they're driven to manipulate others for their personal comfort and power, often with a threat or actual use of violence. So I'll kind of be using these terms interchangeably. Now, I know you, like me, have had some personal experience with one of their kind, Sandy. So that's you might.
I think everybody in our chat probably
Probably,
has had
maybe
experience with a narcissist. If they're not
maybe
one.
maybe having like an intimate relationship with a friend or a family member or romance with a narcissist, maybe that makes you more likely to be doomer, right? Because you're able to finally look at things deeply and see the truth of things.
Maybe.
So yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting research
Maybe.
question. So anyway, back in the day, I was actually researching these groups, and I once stumbled across a sociopath forum where apparently sociopaths gather to anonymously swap tales and strategies. And I found one particular comment like pretty interesting. It was like, the difference between narcissists and sociopaths is narcissists actually believe the lies they tell each other about themselves. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, so most indigenous cultures have strong taboos against narcissism. Like rites of passage you find in nearly all indigenous communities, this cultural stifling of egotistical behavior is found in indigenous cultures around the world. And it goes something like this. Oh, you think you're like a really great special person and you should be especially honored and not have to work as hard as the rest of us? Okay, well, if you're so great, why don't you try and survive on your own? Yeah, good luck with that. And then either the incipient narcissist came crawling back, begging for forgiveness, and stopped with their self-promoting ways and laziness, or their pride led them to try to make it on their own when they'd probably die young and not pass on their genes. Thus, both genes and cultures that promoted narcissism would usually get selected out of long-term survival in indigenous communities, because there your individual survival depends on your community group thriving. If you don't look out for your community, they will not thrive, which means you will probably not thrive. So communities that didn't develop strong taboos against narcissism were not likely to make it. And so generally, narcissistic inclinations never really took root.
Wow.
And the plow came along, and that enabled accumulation societies, which also shifted the view of leadership in indigenous societies. In indigenous cultures, leaders were often seasonal positions. Like maybe one person skilled in diplomacy would lead during intertribe negotiations. Another skilled in management might lead during the peak buffalo hunting time. Another skilled at farming might kind of take charge of divvying up tasks. But in settled societies, food surpluses enabled social stratification. And over time, it was often the narcissists that would weasel their way to the top, through subterfuge, manipulation, and maybe in some cases by rallying their tribe to go to war. And the larger a society becomes, the easier it is for sociopaths to not be discovered and called out. And so as settled communities grew in size, the leaders of these communities shifted from respected community members temporarily taking charge, as was common in indigenous communities, to eventually family dynasties ruling with the approval of the gods, whether that be divine right, mandate of heaven, etc. And so agriculture thus fundamentally changed community norms of weeding out the narcissists to open the door to actually be ruled by them. So the plow reshaped social systems to create a new elite class that could live in luxury, lording over their now subjects, selling fantasy vision of the world that cemented their place on top. Now, fast forward to modern life. Here, a narcissist can not only survive, but thrive in a large settled community. Because if they had income, inherited wealth, or privileged backgrounds helping them scoop up the highest paid jobs in society, their survival does not require that they care for their community. They could exploit the labor of others, animal or human slaves in the agricultural era, now add fossil fuel slaves in the industrial era, and sociopaths are particularly adept at putting themselves in positions where they can disproportionately benefit from this slave labor, which is especially true in the social media age. So in modern societies, we not only tolerate psychopaths, but our society honors and rewards them, despite the fact that they rise often by stepping on others and discarding them. Like case in point, take Elizabeth Holmes from the company Theranos. Like her company was rewarded with billions of dollars despite being a total fraud. Like you couldn't get away with that in a smaller indigenous community. You couldn't not contribute any value to the community, but somehow just see people into thinking you were creating value. That only happens in agricultural and industrial societies. So it's important to understand that narcissists do not see themselves as part of nature, but above it, where nature is just theirs to extract their material and status comforts, and they shape the societies they rule over. So even non-sociopaths end up following this path of nature removal, resource extraction, as this behavior becomes the norms we're been to, and as children, our brains get kind of hardwired and their synapses are formed to kind of think along these ways. Thus, agro-industrial humans, moving ever further away from being in relationship with their natural environment, proceeded to take the narcissist leads and follow people like Elon Musk. I mean, it blows my mind how many people who I think otherwise like are rational and smart and caring, actually think Elon Musk is like a good person doing good things for the environment. Like he's this rich, petty, spoiled white boy, labor exploiting, narcissist, misogynist, devouring con artist, tyrant who's ravaging the earth. And somehow people think he's good. But anyway, I think that's a great transition to view number 3, which is like view number 2, humans are special, except we're actually the worst species that ever lived. This view suggests that there's a special selfishness inherent in our species. Maybe it's an evolutionary flaw, that we develop brains advanced enough to collectively create an industrial civilization, but not advanced enough to deeply question its creation, unable to first get past the petty insecurities triggered by our earlier limbic system, and what Sheldon Solomon would say is the cause we're a bunch of meatbags that have trouble acknowledging that we have an expiration date.
Right.
And so, like that. And so I think this third view, if I'm not mistaken, is very well represented in the doomer community. And at first look, there seems to be a lot of support for this view. We're the first species in history to be responsible for triggering a mass extinction. Well, technically at first complex species, because whatever was the Archean era, I think, where new photosynthesizing cyanobacteria like blue-green algae, they evolved to emit oxygen as a waste product, which not only killed off most anaerobic organisms that lived at the time, basically restricting them to hydrothermal vents, but triggered ice ages lasting hundreds of millions of years that also killed off these new kids on the blocks that caused a mass extinction, right? But what makes us uniquely malevolent is that we know, or at least we should know, that our industrial lifestyles are causing a mass extinction. And so with this view, there's a pretty clear conclusion. We need to go. We're, in the words of William Rees, a plague species, and our extinction should be welcomed to return the earth to balance, as argued by your recent Nick Money essay I believe you read on this channel. And of course, the earth is never in balance. Ecosystems are always in flux due to endogenous factors like volcano activity or exogenous factors like variable solar radiation. But unlike previous mass extinctions, we're giving other species much less time to adapt to these massive planetary shifts. And like I talked about on Sam's channel, those other boundaries besides climate change that are rarely discussed, like ocean acidification, habitat loss, nitrogen cycle disruption, etc.
Although we do.
And, yeah, exactly. You do cover here. Yes, very well. And so in this view, it makes sense to be angry, right? Choose your target for Twitter outrage. fossil fuel executives, corporate CEOs, politicians, and mind you, sociopaths are pretty well represented in these groups. Climate change deniers, or in my case, people who call the town to find their neighbors for supporting biodiverse ecosystems in their backyard, instead of the American default dousing their yards in toxic chemicals to create a monster
Jesus.
golf course. Like, was it like what you're saying?
Ugh.
Is it like, do
Oh,
people have the golf course lawns there? And if they don't, do they get heat for it? Is it like that in Western Europe?
no. First of all, I'm in the county of Amish. Okay, so you can where I live here is anything goes. There's nobody gives a shit what anybody does, and let's see. If your lawn is shitty, if you have junk all over it, fine. If you have a perfectly manicured coiffed lawn, fine. If you're rewilding like I am, fine. That's why I like it here, because really it's basically the freedom to do what you would like to do, that way.
Oh, nice.
For
Well, that's
now.
good.
Yeah.
Hopefully, the bees are thriving there as well as a result.
Well, you are going to come visit with
Yeah,
me.
yeah. Actually, we have to talk about it on. Yeah, maybe I know Sam wants to come up Sunday or Monday, so I'll coordinate with
Yes.
him. I might have to be here Monday, but if we'll figure something out. I'll stay on after the call. Maybe we chat about it.
Okay.
But yeah, so the third view is this like being angry that we're this agro-industrial society that destroyed everything, ruled by narcissists, etc. Then along came William Catton with his seminal book Overshoot, and he proposed a fourth view.
Great book.
And I know most reviewers are probably familiar with him, but for those who aren't, the gist is this: no species are unique, including us. All species, if given the opportunity, will overconsume their resources for a population boom and bust, a rise, and inevitable crash. We're unique in that our intelligence has enabled us to do what no species has done before, that is, harvest prehistoric sunlight, and in a few centuries burn it, which would normally take nature millions of years. Most species rely on sunlight in some form for their caloric intake, directly for plants, indirectly for animal and fungal kingdoms that rely on those plants for their survival. Some species do derive calories from old sunlight, wood, but only we have managed to extract fuel from the prehistoric sunlight, oil, coal, natural gas, the stored energy of life long gone, most of the
Yep.
species now long extinct. And in this view, if bears or dolphins or turtles could have exploited fossil fuels to expand their range, spread their species, and increase their comfort, they would have simply done so. So in views 2 or 3, humans are on a pedestal, the former of praise, the latter of shame. But in this fourth view, we're kicked off the pedestal. We're really no more superior or inferior to any other species. Our fossil-fueled lifestyles have given us short-term good times, longevity, and modern amenities. But year by year, those benefits are slowly giving way to more hardships as we experience increasingly collapsing ecosystems. So in the Catton view, the dominant emotion is kind of grief. It's too bad that we're not as clever as we thought we were. And for a very long time, I held this view. Yes, we're causing great damage, but we're not special, fundamentally much dumber than we give ourselves credit for, clueless effing morons, as our mutual friend would say.
Yeah, the
Um,
CFM.
CFM, right? But then I started to read more about indigenous perspectives, indigenous people that are actually living indigenously, which I would say brings us to view number 5, but really it actually goes back to view number 1, indigenous people as land custodians. So first off, when I say indigenous perspectives, what I mean is indigenous ways of living, not biological DNA purity tests. Like the whole blood quantum is very complicated and it's contentious. It involves colonialism and legislation and rights, and to some degree was imposed on indigenous people by Western government. But that's kind of too complex. I don't want to get into that. But when I say indigenous, what I mean is people living indigenously, using the Aboriginal scholar Tyson Yunkaporta's conception. People whose culture and lifestyle have derived from a particular bioregion and who still rely on that bioregion for their sustenance and well-being, and are thus invested in protecting that particular bioregion. So it's not because indigenous people have some sort of special spirituality tied up with like romanticized conceptions of the noble savage. And maybe later I can talk about that whole where that term comes from.
Sure.
So I'm not saying anyone that has like Lakota blood just gets it and we should automatically defer to their judgments on all environmental issues. I'm focusing on learning from indigenous people that are living in traditional indigenous ways by applying local indigenous knowledge to actually live sustainably. Unlike all the nonsense today called sustainable, which isn't, which is I addressed in the letter, which you regularly address on your show. And I'd like to, distinguish between indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom. Like indigenous knowledge is knowledge specific to a bioregion. That indigenous people who gathered over centuries or millennia learned how, the plants you can eat, etc. But indigenous wisdom is kind of a broader pattern of thinking about that most people that are living indigenously have. Because when ecosystems change, you have to change your practices and beliefs to adapt accordingly. So they're kind of two different ways, but one's very specific to the region, one is a broader way of thinking. So let's say, for example, there's a scientific peer-reviewed studies are inconclusive about whether eating a particular fish can help with kidney disease. Some suggest, say, eating it helps. Others say no positive effects. Indigenous knowledge would know that it's not the fish, but maybe the flower petals that fall in the river during a particular season that, when eaten by the fish and interacting with its body, can create substances that can treat kidney disease or kidney failure. Thus, the studies will only show positive results if the fish were taken at the right season.
Right.
So indigenous wisdom is this kind of broader understanding about the relationships between species and ecosystem, and not just very kind of narrow, focused ways that the scientific method often focuses on. So now, I understand. Go ahead, yes, Annie. Go ahead.
No, this is good. I'm fascinated.
Okay. So now there's some counter arguments to this perspective. I'm suggesting that we should distinguish between the sustainability potential of pre-agricultural empire humans, i.e. indigenous cultures, from the rest of us agro-industrialists. So let me address some of those critiques. Okay. First, counter argument. Many indigenous people today are engaged in the same planetary destruction as the rest of us, such as working in gold mines or otherwise participating in global industrial society. Okay. This is true. But first, we have to distinguish between having just indigenous heritage and blood versus living indigenously. I'm kind of focusing on the latter. But even when we find plenty of examples of indigenous people not living indigenously, we have to appreciate that we're judging how some indigenous people have adapted to survive as colonizers invaded their homes, poisoned their land and their ecosystems. We can't say indigenous people are just like all people if we're judging how some have adapted agro-industrial ways to be able to survive in the face of the global industrial Homo colossus ravaging their lands. Like, can we judge someone who chooses to work in a gold mine to earn income to pay for food because they can no longer live off the land like their ancestors, because there's no longer any salmon in the river from the local industrial society? And so too often we make conclusions about indigenous people after colonial settler contact, assuming their actions were the same before Western contact. Like take, for example, cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. Some anthropologists noted how certain tribes practice cannibalism and assumed these practices were always there, not realizing that these practices probably emerged from contact with white settlers. That is, certain tribes primarily survived by fishing in coastal waters. But when white settlers took over the coast and forced them inland, where they did not have the local knowledge of how to obtain ample protein from the rainforest, well, they adapted for survival. When they killed others in intertribal wars, again, wars that happened only because white settlers forced them off the coast into other tribes' territories, they needed the human nutrients because they didn't have the local knowledge of how to obtain those nutrients from the rainforest because they weren't indigenous to the rainforest. They were primarily coastal people living off fishing. So you have to separate indigenous behavior in response to the trauma of settler contact versus indigenous behavior before. Now, of course, without written records, we often don't know what that behavior was. But we do know our planet seemed to be doing just fine for the roughly 300,000 years or so we existed as a species before agricultural communities became the dominant form of social organization. I mean, you can't deny this fact. Indigenous people are 5% of the global population, yet they're custodians of 80% of Earth's biodiversity. Clearly, Earth is doing much better where indigenous people are living indigenously. Of course, indigenous communities are not perfect, but what we must acknowledge is that where they are able to live in traditional ways, their natural environments are much healthier than anywhere else on Earth. Okay. Counter argument number 2, the megafauna were wiped out wherever indigenous people went. Now, if you have like a kind of essentialist noble savage view, you might want to deny this fact, saying like, oh, it can't be true. They're just more spiritual and moral. They know better than to wipe out the megafauna. But it's true. It happens sometimes, though not always due to humans destroying the environment. Just as often, if not more often, it was related to regular climate shift that happened before our stable Holocene era. But yes, sometimes indigenous hunter-gatherers killed off keystone species when they traveled to a new ecosystem. But we need to appreciate that many indigenous communities had cultures that lasted for thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years, meaning they have cultures that survive for millennia. They're time-tested. In fact, many of these communities probably have, at some point in their long history, destroy their local ecosystems. But the fact that they still exist means they learn from those previous planet-destroying errors, such as the folly of building large urban communities, and have since adapted by abandoning those early destructive practices and returning to moving with the land and being custodians of nature. So in this case, Canton would be right. All species will initially overexploit their resource base if they can, but Canton's view leaves no room for learning, as most indigenous communities have shown the capacity to learn from the error of their ways and adjust accordingly. Okay. 2 more counter arguments. Number 3,
I'm ready.
no human should be land custodians. Nature is always better at management than humans. Again, I have a lot of sympathy with this view. From cane toads introduced to Australia to kudzu in the Carolinas, certainly when Westerners have tried to improve on nature's ecosystem functioning, they've usually made things worse, often much worse. But in contrast, where indigenous people have lived, they have often improved on nature's design. For instance, we're all rightfully lamenting the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. But for millennia, the Amazon hasn't been this untouched wild space, but has actually been in some ways positively cultivated by indigenous people living there. Many indigenous people there have improved forest resiliency and biodiversity, sometimes adding to biodiversity by not letting certain select trees dominate the forest canopy, crowding out light to all other plants, or horticultural practices that created more biodiversity, or in drier climates use controlled burns to help reseed forests, as well as prevent the growth of really dense foliage that would be more susceptible to out of control burns. Part of what's happening in California, right? It's not just climate change. It's also the fact that settlers prevented local indigenous people who knew from living there for millennia, oh no, you have to burn the forest sometimes. And under penalty of death, they were forbidden from doing so. And so part of what we're seeing in California today is the consequence of not respecting indigenous understanding of how to manage the environment. But because we agro-industrialists have been privileged to live in the Holocene era, our historical experience has mainly been one, give or take up like little occasional warming periods, cooling periods, relative temperature stability, giving us the illusion that nature naturally achieves some sort of balanced homeostasis. But nature can also naturally cause extinctions. For instance, in the Devonian era, 370 million years ago, when trees first appeared, this world's first forest spread uncontrollably, and it triggered a marine mass extinction by some combination, they think, of either excess of nutrient dumping in the shallow seas, or by sucking up all the carbon dioxide, which dramatically cooled the planet. The balance only came after the mass extinction. And for the record, trees have seemed to learn how to better coexist with other species. So I won't go so far to say indigenous actions always improve on nature, but many times they have, and we should acknowledge that. Okay. And so the final counter argument is, but we can't all go back to being hunter-gatherers, not with 8 billion of us and all the existing planetary damage.
We can't?
We can't.
You're
No,
kidding.
apparently not.
Apparently not.
Even if we acknowledge that 99% of humans are planet destroyers and 1% are planet custodians, that 1% can't save the Earth from the 99%. It's too late. Okay, again, fair point. I'm devoting this time to discuss indigenous perspectives, not with the motivation, guys, if you all just listen to indigenous people, we're going to figure this out. Yeah. Yes, it's too late to save us. Industrial society is coming down, and billions of beings will cease to exist in its wake. But I don't think it's too late for recognizing that some human communities have been capable of managing an environment, rather than simply declaring every human that ever existed as part of an irredeemable plague species. It might make you be more apt to be an indigenous advocate and take time to learn from them. 2, doing little things to make the planet more livable for humans and non-humans alike right now. Composting your food waste, putting it in your yard, letting flowering species take over grass lawns to help the pollinators. If nothing else, you'll be happier seeing nature flourish in your midst, even if it's just a temporary boom before the planet warms beyond the capacity for complex life to survive. And if you have any investment in helping others, including future generations, and I mean both humans and non-humans, manage some way to live a somewhat less miserable future, appreciating that advocacy for indigenous conceptions of loving the land and as land custodians is essential. And so this indigenous focus is about long-term resilience if our capacity to extract fossil fuels collapses before our planet bakes in 5C warming. And I recognize it's a big if, right? So in the chance that maybe there's a lot less oil that the Saudis and others have been promoting and things fall apart sooner, I think we have a better window of the planet adapting. Obviously, if we're burning oil for decades to come, that becomes a lot more bleak. And so I see this temptation to say all humans suck. It's a compelling left brain narrative. It's more emotionally fulfilling to say, screw us humans, good to see us go, rather than maybe a more nuanced, well, unfortunately, the sociopaths and narcissists among us created an agro-empire arms race. Most of our ancestors and ourselves were born into this agro-industrial arms race, and thus our brain synapse in childhood adapted to this agro-industrial way of life. RIP complex life on Earth, right? It's much better to just say, screw all the humans, have them all go. And so, yeah.
That's kind of like, that I think gives us the magical thinking there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, nice. I got the, I
Yeah.
got the
Oh,
feels.
you got the magical
I got the
thing.
tinglies. Nice. So yeah, so I guess that sums up different views of humanity and how indigenous ways
Very
of living
interesting.
complicate the humanity story. But but don't take my word for it. Take this as an invitation to learn directly from indigenous people. Before you conclude all humans are the same in a plague species, I'd recommend at least taking a little time to engage with indigenous voices. Some great books include like especially this book Sand Talk by Tyson Yucaporta. You could also, if you don't want to read, he has like a bunch of YouTube videos. He insists he's no
Can you
guru.
say that again and show us? Move it closer. Sand. Okay. Sand talk. All right.
Yeah.
All right. We'll put that
Yeah.
in the show notes. I'll put that in the
Yeah,
show notes,
and
guys.
Bob and Walt Kimmerer, she's a local upstate professor. She
Mm-hmm.
wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. Victor Stephenson wrote about like how you manage forests with fire and fire country. So yeah, I think you can only conclude traditional indigenous lifestyles are not a model to learn from if you've never learned about indigenous perspectives, or if you've only ever learned from non-indigenous people describing and dismissing indigenous people. Like take for example, ceremonial dances. Western anthropologists would see these ceremonies and conclude, oh, they're just expressions of religious devotion with simple children's morality tales. But actually, these dances often had very complex messaging embedded with them, such as where to find water during a drought, or what bushes to eat during a famine. Or, if a West African storyteller casually mentioned like a tree pangolin in a story, an anthropologist might understand it as anthropomorphizing regional animals, while not realizing that the West African indigenous people hearing that story know that when you mention tree pangolins, the hidden message is this understood metaphor that don't be like the foolish tree pangolin that lets the leopard know it's vulnerable to attack by exposing its unprotected underbelly. In other words, don't share detailed information with Westerners who will use indigenous knowledge in inaccurate and indestructive ways.
Oh,
Instead, just tell them a story like we tell 5-year-olds. They can probably handle that. So, in
that's
closing,
interesting.
the story of global industrialization has been the story of erasing indigenous people, both metaphorically, culturally, and actually genocide. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, especially, Western writers would repeatedly write of indigenous people as if they've either already vanished or their disappearance was inevitable. Like I'm reminded of that scene in Monty Python during the plague, where like the guy he's on the wheelbarrow and he's like, "I'm not dead yet," and the person delivers the dead boy said,
Yep.
"No, shut up, you will be soon enough." And it's actually
True.
it's funny, but it's sad because it's similar to how many in North America have written about indigenous people. Oh, it's so tragic how many the Native Americans were all killed, and they're like actually like we're still here.
Yeah.
We're part of society. And so, so indigenous cultures are the products of hundreds of thousands of years of indigenous wisdom. Settled agricultural communities have thousands of years of gathered wisdom. Industrial societies have only a few hundred. So if you're someone who likes to learn, either for the love of learning itself or as a guide for how to live and what to teach others, I invite you to consider mixing up your reading to include indigenous voices. We have a whole lot to learn from them.
Oh, I believe.
That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
I feel that that's completely real, and by the fact that where I lived when my daughter was little, we lived right on the border of the Seneca Nation, and she dated from age 13 Nate, who was for years they dated. We couldn't stop them from being together, so our families kind of enmeshed together, and he was an Onondaga, but we learned from each other and we learned from them. And I feel, blessed that we got to have that experience. I mean, the kids broke up, but I think they were, I don't know, together, 7, 8 years, but they're still friends, and I'm still friends with his mom. And it was a good experience. But of course, they had been relegated to the reservation. And
Yeah,
it's a difficult thing.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Onondaga Nation. So there's another book was written by I think Audra Simpson's her name.
That's closer to you.
Mohawkus Interruptus. Yeah. And how even things like Onondaga Nation, like often when Westerners would talk about it, like there's actually a lot of division in the community about like, do we work with the white people or do we ignore their interests? Like, do we get a US passport? Or do we say, no, we're not going to get a US passport. We're an independent nation. We're going to get our own passport, like the Mohawks, many Mohawks have. And so it's interesting too that like even when you hear like impressions of the community, often like Westerners would choose the narrative that was more appealing to them. Oh yeah, we're going to tell Onondaga history as if the history of like they're the group that decided to work with us and live with us, when in fact within the community it's obviously there's divisions about what the extent to which they should accommodate their values in order to survive in a settler colonial landscape. So yes, it's
Settler colonial. There you go. That's really what it's all about. History of settler colonial nations, and all the Western nations are settler colonials. I mean, Australia, UK, they everybody has gone in and conquered. Conquered all over, everywhere. So we are definitely part of that. I would say.
yeah,
I
yeah.
would say, yeah. So we have a few comments, and I want to go over a couple of them, and it's going to lead into what we were, talking about earlier. Uh, I guess I'll just go right into it. I'm going to go right into it. Sat 12 is one of our friends, and he has inspired me before. I'm believing Sat 12 is a gentleman. Please forgive me, but I must point out some truths here. Despite the indigenous rhetoric, this man has been to 160 countries with return flights 2 times equals 360 plane flights. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, at first, it's not so simple as that. Like, I would usually like get a grant to go to one country like Swaziland, and then visit 5 to 10 countries around by bus, and then fly home. So it wasn't always like one flight, one country. It was often like clustered. When you're a teacher or a student, you have off all summer, you can do that cluster. Okay. But yeah, fair point. Yeah, I'm not claiming at all to be like I'm this wonderful person that I'm living the lifestyle that we don't. I'm not living indigenously. Obviously, I get on planes and I fly places. Much less now, both due to COVID and just I kind of seriously cut back as much as I used to travel. But yeah, but that's kind of like when I'm sharing ideas about indigenous people. That does not have anything to do with my personal life. I'm asking to evaluate the ideas on their merits.
Right.
Because again, I'm not in any sense claiming we should all live indigenously because I'm living indigenously. No, I'm saying we would all be better off if we learn from and how to live indigenously. I do a little bit like in the summer, about half the food I eat comes out of my yard. I know what plants and weeds I can eat. You can eat violet, you can eat purslane, you can eat lamb's quarter, you can eat dandelion, right? So like that's kind of indigenous, but no, that's obviously I still go to the supermarket for half of my food.
Right.
Obviously, I still have a fan on when it's hot. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's a fair
I
point.
don't think there is anyone here in the chat that is living indigenously. And
Right,
I
we're all
don't
on a
think,
computer, right?
yeah,
So
and we're all on a
that itself is
computer and everyone, but it's always easy to point out these things that seem to not fit. However, as I was going through making the video and looking at your pictures, I was living vicariously through you. I mean, the picture behind us is one of yours. They were absolutely magnificent. They were beautiful. And like Jordan Perry says right here, no one can pass the purity test. We are all civilization sinners. We can't. And, somebody's here giving the white privilege words, but I don't understand what that means in terms of education and all. I mean,
well, actually, if I could tie the
yeah,
education
tie
to
this in.
travel. So yeah, I obviously there's some moral judgments you have to make, right? Like I run study abroad trips, or again, at least before COVID, to China usually, and yeah, so obviously we're all getting on a flight and we're going to China, so we have to weigh the value of you put carbon in the air on your flight, you burn the kerosene, versus what was the value of the exchange in terms of, and so like I teach collapse awareness, right? Like I make it very clear that society is fragile, and I think it's actually probably a lot easier to make that case now, right, with all the supply lines and the gas prices, etc. And so I tell them like, yeah, okay, you're putting carbon in the air, but what are you getting out of the trip? Like if you're just going to a resort in Cancun, then yeah, it's hard to justify that as like making any value to that, But if you're learning from Chinese people and making connections with people, and also like I really think that at some point this century, like people aren't just going to go to China, right? Maybe some rich people that manage to hoard fuel and planes can still make these trips, but most of people are not going to be flying anywhere. And so I tell my students who are in China, like, you might be the ambassadors for China, right? Like 30 years from now, like you might meet a Chinese American who's never been to China and can't get to China. You can tell them about China. You can share, you can kind of be someone to pass down in your local community what China was like from your perspective. You know, maybe have some pictures, maybe some artifacts. So I kind of tell them that kind of deal. Like, it's not just, yes, it's about building empathy and making greater connection with people and learning. And then, and again, I teach teachers, so they have these experiences and they bring them back to their classrooms. But it's also like, you know, if you're collapse aware, understand, like, be grateful for that trip, because when there's no longer any flights, you're the ambassador for that experience. And that's kind of nice to think. I think if some people can pass down stories of China in their local communities when people aren't, you know, flying to China anymore.
Okay. Well, let's see. What have we got here, guys? I see that there's a lot of chatting out there. There are different. I have a tough. I have a tough audience sometimes. I love Rob. Rob, are you so pure? 169 countries. What is he, Rockefeller?
160.
Thank you, Rob.
No, so
Thanks,
you know,
Rob.
as Sandy knows, actually, no, I don't have much money at all. But when you're a professor, you write grants, and when you get grants, they cover everything. They cover your travel, your hotel, your
And I
expenses.
was a grant administrator. I was a research administrator, so I understand it. So I
So yeah,
suppose my white privilege is showing here too.
so once you learn the grant
Christ.
writing game, that's how you can travel a lot. Yeah, because again, what I would do is I get a grant to one country, and then after my work research was done, I just spend a month or two taking bus to a bunch of local countries, and that's how I got to do a lot of the traveling. And often I did it on the cheap. Sometimes I hitchhiked. You know, sometimes I slept in the street. That's male privilege, like sleeping not in a hotel because you want to save money and you just kind of like sleep on a park bench. I totally admit that's male privilege. But yeah.
Well, there's lots of privilege. We live in the United States,
Yeah.
you know. Now, you grew up in New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
I knew that you didn't have the Western or Central New York accent.
Well, you
Now,
know,
were you accused of having white privilege when you grew up in New Jersey?
well, being Latino, it's kind of complicated, right? Because you know, some people actually use the term "white person of color." It's because I mean, I'm Cuban. I grew up in a Cuban neighborhood. You know, my father's a Cuban immigrant. You know, most people I went to high school with spoke Spanish, if sometimes it's their
Okay.
first language. So yeah, I mean, I'm Latino in that sense, but obviously I have relatively light skin. So I kind of, my own experiences is kind of complicated. Yeah, I get discriminated against when people see my name, Jimenez, and
Hmm.
sometimes when they know or suspect or find out I'm Latino, but I can pass as being white and then get all the privileges of being
Well,
white. So
obviously, because our chatter says that you live off the poor, you're a typical white elitist. Rob, I disagree, but you know what? It's okay. There's always one in every crowd, and he's got the Bernie Sanders picture as his. So I don't know where he's going with all this. Too bad, Rob. I don't know where you're going with this,
yeah, I'd be afraid to read
but
your comments just because, like, when I was talking about, you know, learning for Indigenous people, I could just imagine comments were like, "We're all going to be extinct in 5 years, so what's the point?" So I'll
well,
read them
listen.
afterwards, but I won't
I
read them
know I
now.
have a tough crowd. I know I have a tough crowd. So, guys, do you have more questions, or is it going to be let's beat up Jeremy tonight? Because
Bring it
all right,
on.
Fat Boy would like to hear more wisdoms. Is there? All right, here I have a question. So, besides your your indigenous discussion, what else do you talk to your students? I know you were talking about in the other interview with Sam about what the future holds and how they can look at the future. Why don't you expound on this a little bit more?
Yeah. So, well, one thing I can talk about the future in a second, but I also focus a lot on more on industrialization than capitalism. You know, don't get me like academics love to talk about capitalism, right? And specifically money, and yeah, money's really screwed with like our social interaction. Like again, in traditional societies, it wasn't like I'm giving you three baby goats now, and you give me three baby goats next year. It was more like hey, you need some goats, here you go. And then when I need something in the future, I know you got my back. Whereas money's warped our capacity to form relationships. Like, here's the money, now do the thing. Where we become more about concerned with the value for our money than seeing ourselves in relationship with the person helping us, which is much more indigenous about seeing your interaction with people like in deep relationships. But all that said, I think industrialization is even worse than capitalism and as being our downfall. Like, I mean, just take, for example, the non-capitalist Soviet Union. Like, what an ecological catastrophe. I mean, like, dude, just like focus on water. Like, the Soviets turned the Aral Sea to a desert. They erased half the Black Sea coast with overdevelopment. They made Lake Karachay the most radioactive, polluted place on Earth in the late 80s. They poisoned the marine life in Lake Baikal. Or concerning marine life, how about the largest whale massacre in history? 1959 to 1960 was one whaling season. Soviet whalers murdered something like 180,000 whales, all to meet Soviet quotas, right? So it wasn't capitalism, but it was still embedded in an industrial system where we did this damage. So I think a lot of people love to focus on capitalism because very few people talk about this bigger threat of industrialization. Maybe it's you can focus on critiquing capitalism because you can tell yourself a story like, well, if we just have all the billionaires be less billionary, then we can all have a great middle class life. Whereas when you go after industrialization, you have to come to terms with, yeah, I guess we have to kind of stop constructing all commercial buildings and stop having trucks shipping consumer goods on fossil fuel based asphalt roads, right? So I talk a lot about, like, because all the other professors talk about capitalism, I'm like, don't lose sight of industrialization. But yeah, as far as like teaching them about the future, well, I mean, it's tough because I want to be honest, but like I don't want to have them totally shut down to the point where if you follow what you guys talk about on this channel a lot, you could be like, well, what is the point? Because I think a lot of people in this channel maybe are more like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They're hoping to kind of just squeeze by before everything falls apart. But if you're a 20-year-old and you make it seem like, oh no, like there's no way you're going to survive in the future. I mean, yeah, that's possible, surely, but I do my best to talk about ways what could be positive when industrial society is gone. Yeah, of course, there's much more hardship. Of course, it's much more. But like industrial society sucks. Like, yeah, it's nice to set your temperature control, and it's nice to have all the different foods from around the world, and it's nice to stay in touch with people you met, using technology. Of course, all that's great, but it's also extremely oppressive and it's extremely alienating. And we become more and more kind of like sucked into these algorithms and we're not seeing people in person. So I try to tell them, like, think about your best memories in life. There are probably times that weren't very technology based, right? They're like you and your friends hanging around, you went camping, or you're playing sports, right? Things that don't require an industrial civilization. And that's a way to kind of imagine, try to as you teach your students, think about how can I move between the two worlds, like the world we're living in now, where you have the standardized tests and all that nonsense. They're told are important in schooling, but there's a world that is coming. We don't know when it's coming, but it's coming. What can you do to reimagine education for that world, to both like make education more meaningful for the students that you teach and for themselves, but also to actually have a better chance of somehow putting together a living as we experience all this ecosystem collapse.
So when you say hard, do you want to live a hard life or a horrible life? Do we have a choice? Do they have a choice? I mean, I have a 33-year-old. It's already hard for her, but is it going to be hard or horrible?
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's like those are our options. The choice, like the choices we make individually, collectively, can make the only hard outcome somewhat more likely. But yeah, it might. I acknowledge, right? There was just, I think it was even in CNN today. I read a story that said like they predicted this weather pattern in 2020 that UK would have in 2050, and then they have it now this summer. Like they're about to get it. So yeah, things are happening way faster, always than everyone ever expected, right? The number one byline, faster than expected. But we don't know. We don't know a lot, right? So I'm not certain about anything, other than like my own death and eventually society collapse, right? Because it runs on oil. Oil's finite.
Death and taxes.
Death and taxes, yeah. But we don't know. We don't know how people can find a way to manage afterwards. I just know it's going to be hard, physically hard with temperature and growing food. It's going to be hard psychologically, giving up all these comforts we had. But there can be a path forward for some, maybe, right? And I know that is too much hope, maybe, for some on this
Well,
panel, but
we don't know, and we never. No, don't pigeonhole this channel because I call it the
no, not
environmental
yourself. The comment just
umbrella
the
because
comment
the
just already.
thing,
Yeah.
all right, because the thing is, we don't know. And anybody that says they know for a fact what's going to happen tomorrow is full of shit. Okay? And so nobody knows. We feel it, we read, we're not blind. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever. It's not the point for me. For me, the point is quality, not quantity. I have that thought I tell my kid. I'm sure that's what you tell your students. And again, I want to go back to the Rob, this Rob, who's actually, Rob, you're driving me crazy because Rob's is not usually on this channel. So for some reason he came tonight. Obviously doesn't understand that until we're done, we're done. And kids are going to school and they are going to higher ed. And I happen to fucking know what professors make in higher ed. And Dr. Jimenez is not making, he is not rich. So Rob, you know what? You've pissed me right the fuck off, okay? I'm always really nice, but you got under my skin. So if you're not a regular here, why are you coming to start shit? Because you sound like a troll. I'm done. I had to do it because it's annoying. I'm sorry. I don't usually do that. But he doesn't know his ass from his elbow. He's obviously just, regurgitating his Twitter feed. Sorry. Okay, now that I did that, I'm sorry. I usually don't lose it, but I really, it's annoying. Pet cab. How should we interrogate capitalism? That's a wild question.
So yeah, I guess that's kind of I somewhat I guess address this with the focus on
Mm-hmm.
industrialization. But yeah, I mean, capitalism is this world we're stuck in, right? Like, we're all hardwired to live in this world, and it's hard to imagine it's going to go away until the oil goes away, right? Because I think socialism on a local scale works nice, people sharing resources, but if it's trying to like think that we're gonna the China or Russia model, we want that instead, like industrialization, like yeah, that's a major issue. So yes, I think yeah, maybe he asked that question before he heard me say my spiel about capitalism and
Okay.
industrialization, but yeah.
Well, Keith says, yeah, the scourge of the earth, capitalism. Well, I think we all agree on that. But we all live within the parameters of that. And no
Right.
one, I mean, there's no one here that doesn't. I'm sorry. Unless you're in, well, I don't think there's anybody here that's from a country that is not. All right, let's see here.
And it's an overdrive, right? So it's obviously worse and worse because
Oh,
as you get more and more concentration of wealth and power, they have more and more influence on the government, and therefore more and more they get more and more wealth and power. I mean, yeah, the pandemic, the amount of money concentrated by has been absolutely absurd, and yeah, it's. I would like to see more. Very simply, greater progressive taxation, right? Like that's a simple thing that's not complicated. There's really hard to make an argument against it, but yeah.
did Jeremy use hot water in his shower? For fuck's sake, what an asshole. I love the way this is going because you know what? I don't usually get my moxie up, but like this, but what the hell? Thanks, Jen. All right, Sam's with us, but Sam is not able to join live. He can't. So somebody had asked for Sam to join, but let's see, Gary. Gary, thank you for being a moderator, by the way, and Kim, thank you for being a moderator. Gary, I keep telling myself and others, love deeply, live gently, and let go gracefully. And also, fierce love speaks truth to power in the face of injustice to protect nature and nurture life. Your thoughts, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, I think I'm fully on board with that. Yeah, I think there was a time I got on the hate machine of like just full of anger and rage. But it's yeah, I think a lot of people will say anger is necessary for social change. Maybe that's true in some circumstances, but I think giving too much into anger, sometimes you need that motivation to
I'm
get
getting
out. Like
angry.
Roe vs. Wade has been taken off, and you need that anger to get you onto the streets. Like, I get that. But like an ever consuming anger, like I just think it starts to impact your personal relationships. It starts to
Oh,
cloud your vision. You start to get kind of more fixated on left brain thought patterns, and you're not able to kind of think open minded anymore. So yeah, I think that idea of like you to like having a greater sense of love and empathy is a more effective way to deal with injustice than getting all like angry and riled up and like what do most a lot of
uh-huh.
people do today who get angry? They go on Twitter, right? What does that do? It
Yeah,
just
I
basically
was just
sucks up all
going
your
to
energy on
say.
Twitter and nothing in the real world,
I
right? So
do it. I'm guilty. I mean, I do it. I go on Twitter. I get pissed off today. In fact, it was just on Facebook, and it was a friend of mine that pissed me off, and it was something ignorant. So I get angry and I watch myself. I have to put myself
and
in
it's
check. I
designed.
never used Twitter before 2 years ago, and then all of a sudden, I have to separate the politics Twitter from the doomosphere Twitter, which I find much more palatable and much more respectful. We have a nice little community, which Jordan, that's here, is part of it, and there's several people. Scott, it's a much better Twitter community than.
And it's designed to make you angry. Like
Of
that's how
course
the
it
algorithm.
is.
That's the number one way to like they measured engagement, and like when they make people angry, that's when they stayed on longer, and that's when they want you. They want you to stay on longer, keep clicking notifications, responding. So yeah, it's designed to make you angry, and I think social media is okay if you can kind of actually moderate your uses, like 5 minutes in the morning, night, or occasionally you go on like discussions, etc. But if you find yourself getting angry and stuff like that regularly, it's making you feel terrible. It's
I
making
have
you
to
lash
stop.
at others, creating reactive attitudes,
Yeah.
and nothing's changing. So why? Yeah, just kind of cut the
Well, it
cord.
happens to me, and I'm being honest. It does happen to me, and I let myself get angry tonight because we have someone here who I consider is like, holier than thou,
I
whoever this
appreciate
this guy thinks he is. I'd like
I
to know how
appreciate your
he
anger on
lives.
my behalf, Sandy. Since yeah,
It is,
appreciate
it is, it is. All right. So there is some discussion. Hi, hello, Jonathan. Jonathan says colonialism is the cause of cannibalism among indigenous populations. You already lost me. Tribal warfare involving ritual cannibalism is as own as humanity, even older. Look at chimpanzees. Is there?
Yeah, no. What I'm not saying is that like cannibalism has only existed because of colonialism. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying is
Okay.
you can't make a judgment when you go see an indigenous society that has experienced colonialism. You only know that culture you're observing from that colonial impact. So you can't make a judgment of any particular thing not knowing what was previous. But no, yeah, cannibalism, right, is has existed. Not does not have you do not need colonialism for there to be cannibalism. I'm just giving one example
Okay.
of how people making judgments of indigenous cultures without having actually understood that that culture changed in response to colonial contact. That's all.
Jordan again. Everything good is deadly at scale. We exist at scale and cannot be deadly in enacting our civilization at that scale. Jordan is wise. Jordan is with Karen, his wife, has a collapsed community online, and they're doing some good work. They're doing some definitely good work. All right. So what's going on here? All right. It's a very interactive channel. So Sat again says, I'm reminded of Sam's reality check on the indigenous he observed when he was in the Amazon. And then Sam came on and said, okay, I will gladly challenge Jeremy to a noble savage live debate whenever he is ready, but only if he picks up the tab for the margaritas. All right.
All right, if
Listen.
you pay for the tacos, deal.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, Sam and I, we've had many conversations about this. Yeah, it's one of the ways that we diverge in our assessment of things. Um, and wait, what was the previous comment? I forgot.
Okay. Let me find it. Oh boy. It was, Oh, geez, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I was
I
talking about
think I
Sam.
would.
Yeah, Sam's experience in
Yes,
the with
Sam.
the
Yeah, the Amazon. Right.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. Again, about like the argument is not that the blood of a person means they're living perfectly, right? Like no, like but when you see a person in the Amazon working for a logging company or a gold mine, like they weren't working for a logging company or gold mine before colonialism, right? Before their
Right.
place was taking over. And so the
Right.
fact that they're working in the gold mine is if they can no longer find food because their ecosystem has been destroyed, they have to, and they don't know how they can't adapt quickly enough, then you have to make accommodations with industrial society. So that's what I would say there. But yeah, it's not the noble savage, the idea that like this conception that Native American indigenous people are more holy or more spiritual, like that idea of the noble savage, we tend to think like we put the words together, oh, because they thought they were like really like spiritual and deep noble. No, noble was literally like when I think it was the French settlers came, they saw all the men were hunting. And they were like, oh, that's kind of interesting because in Europe, only the nobles hunted, right? Like, because the king's forest was the king's forest. If you were a peasant and you took a deer from the king's forest, you'd be killed. So they thought it was interesting that all these men who didn't have a lot of possessions were doing all the hunting. So they called them the noble savage, right? Because they're noble in the sense that they're doing what nobles do. Nobles go hunting. So that's kind of, but that over time, that word got kind of morphed to kind of being like, oh, they're like high, special, spiritual people, but that's not originally where the term was intended. Yeah, it got used by Rousseau to kind of like that conception, but yeah.
Okay. All right. So here's another one. I'm giving. Oh, here, my friend. Here's my girlfriend. Which culture is most at risk for collapse, Jeremy?
Probably the ones already collapsing, like Sri Lanka. Yeah, I think most at risk is probably tropical because the heat waves will make it much harder to sustain food production in those areas. Even though the temperature won't change as much in tropical areas,
Mm-hmm.
it's enough to kind of, if you have too long of a heat wave or a dry spell or a drought or flooding, it's, that's just increasingly happening. So I would suspect tropical countries that don't have access to fossil fuels to make their life bearable by be able to import food with the fossil fuels by creating infrastructure using the fossil fuels, those are the ones that are going to be in a lot of trouble. And again, I think it's kind of fits the bill for Sri Lanka, right? Sri Lanka is a tropical country that does not produce its own, doesn't have an oil industry or fossil fuel. So it's obviously there's corruption and all that too, but yeah, it's troubled to be in a place like that. Pacific Islands too, right? Because they're literally shrinking, and arable
Yeah.
land is getting destroyed by rising salt water. So yeah, I think those are the places that
Oh,
are most
my
troubled.
gosh. All right. Any idea of how we wrestle control away from powerful fossil fuel interests? They're not just going to surrender without a fight. Power without a fight. What do you think? You have thoughts of that on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Extinction Rebellion, trying to shut down the power, but it's such a small people that are willing to make that sacrifice personally. I don't really know. I think first we
Gotcha.
have to acknowledge how much fossil fuels is in our lives that we like, right? Like on one hand, you have to live with this uncomfortable truth. Yes, burning of fossil fuels is causing catastrophic global warming, and it's going to kill all complex life eventually when the planet warms out of control, right? At the same time, basically everything in 2022 uses fossil fuels, right? Like computers,
Uh-huh.
all the furniture, the asphalt roads, food in the
Everything.
supermarkets, everything, right? So the question is like, who's really willing to give up fossil fuels? Like in theory, we can say end the fossil fuels, but then unless you're an indigenous person living on the land, right, such a small percentage of the world population, you're using fossil fuels. So how can you tell someone to stop something when you're still using it? Not
Right.
again, but you
And
still need to find a way to pare it down and to the essentials, right? Maybe the essentials is just kind of like healthcare and food production and stop making toys, right? Like we don't need to make another toy anytime ever again. So maybe, I don't know, consumer boycotts of unnecessary things that, because most things produced use oil as an input. So maybe it's like an indirect way to stop the oil production. If there's no consumer thing feeding into it, that just takes away their power because less people are using it. But I certainly don't have any clear answer. It's not an easy thing to solve. It's predicament.
No, it's not. All right. Sat, I'm giving you the floor again because you don't come for every stream and you always ask good questions. If someone believes in doom on a deep level, and this is a word, this word is synonymous with hopeless futility. What is the psychological effect on people? And as a professor, I'm sure that that might come up actually. And this
Yeah.
is Sat's thing with my channel. This is the doom thing.
Well, if you are either doomer curious,
Or doomer
I highly
adjacent like you. Yeah.
yeah, I highly recommend the Swedish film Aniara. Oh my god, that film is terrifying. I don't want to give away spoiler alert, okay?
Okay,
But it's
Aniara.
about a trip to Mars. But it really gets to the psychological level of like, what does it mean to kind of come to terms with like the jig is up and there is no future. So watch that film if you can handle it, man. It is not an easy film to watch. I think it's a wonderful film, but it's tough. It's
All right.
intense. But yeah, I think well, to some extent, futility, like nothing ever lasts forever, right? Like if you take the long view, the Earth is eventually going to get absorbed by the sun, right? And even if we did colonize Mars, eventually Mars would get colonized and burnt up probably by the sun as well. So nothing lasts forever, and all human enterprises would have eventually come to end. It's just going to happen a lot sooner than we had initially had hoped and planned. But take it even further, heat death of the universe, right? And maybe you want to like debate, well, maybe there won't be heat death. Maybe it'll be kind of like the big crunch where the universe will expand and contract and it'll all start over again. Maybe, who knows? But the whole point is that
that's for the physicists.
That's for the physicists to debate.
Yes.
Yeah. But nothing lasts forever, right? And everything was going to fall apart eventually. It's just happening sooner. So it's more about kind of adapting to letting go with the idea that you might have had a normal life and a positive, safe, secure life, and now you won't, and even less likely for your children and your students and other species and generations. But once you come to that kind of sense of impermanence, you kind of can be more gratitude for every day you wake up and hey, there's still people I love around and there's still water coming out of the tap. And I'm glad that I had water today, and I'm glad that I had friends and family today. And I'll take it.
I'm glad I have water. We're in a drought here. Are you in a
Yeah,
drought
I know.
over there?
Yeah.
Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah, it's like
I'm,
officially no, but it definitely feels like a drought. Although I have to say,
we are in this county. We are definitely
you are
in
in
a
the
drought.
West. Yeah,
And
I saw the map.
am doing things now that are water conservation methods and buckets, and while it's not raining, so I can't connect. But people from out west that have water conservation techniques are helping me figure out, what I can do. But it is not fun because last year at this time, I was drowning with rain and my basement was continually flooding. And now it's this, so there is no guarantee of anything that ever look like, if you think there's a normal, or even if it's a new normal, there's no new normal. So.
Right, and even like upstate New York, right? We talk about being the sanctuary, but it's just a relative sanctuary. It's just like you have a better reasonable chance of living a better life longer here. But yeah, even upstate New York is not immune from the droughts. And
Hell
the
no, it's not. Okay, let's see, guys. You're doing pretty good. He said, Sam said he's pretty sure Cortland County's officially in drought. He knows Tioga has to be.
Maybe
so
it is. Yeah, maybe I haven't.
It's happening. It's
yeah,
happening,
it certainly feels like a drought. Definitely feels like a drought. Absolutely. But I will say though, that my neighbors, most of them, and I like most of them, but they have most of them the golf course lawns. Well, one I don't like. He often challenges me on my ecological garden and my native habitats and weeds and all that.
Moron.
But I will say my yard is the only yard that doesn't look like a desert right now because it has clover, and clover does fine in a drought. It's full of clover, and the clover so far is not dried up. But those who have the golf course lawns, they look like deserts basically.
Trulia, she had no drought. 6 inches rain last night just to the west. See, it's also
Bring it here.
What does Paul Beckwith call it? Weather Whiplash, is he the one that
Weather
coined
weirding, weather whiplash.
Weather Whiplash? No, Weather Weirding is Kathleen.
He hasn't been making as
Kathleen
many
Ahern.
videos lately. I went to
He
check for.
had one today. He
Oh, he
had
did.
one
Okay, because
today. Yes,
I was
he
last
did.
week. I didn't see hadn't made any in a while. I was like,
Keith's
didn't get.
weeds are
I bet.
doing great.
Exactly.
Oh, Sam's clover's drying up by the hour. All
Oh,
right.
really? Oh, so maybe I'm lucky because I'm a further half hour, 40 minutes north, so hasn't caught up with me yet.
Yeah. Okay. I know that there was another one that I wanted to. Oh, okay, Jackie again. Please address religion and its impact on civilization. And for that question, we've got to do that's the $1 million big one. All right. Sorry if that was too loud in your ears, guys. I forgot to turn it on lower. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I talked about this a little bit, where how we moved from kind of the hunter-gatherer mother goddesses to the kind of Judeo-Christian male tyrant deity, and that very much reshaped the role of our kind of reverence and appreciation of nature versus like nature's our plaything. Not to say that everyone who is of a Western religion is committed to destroying the earth officially, but there is that major shift happened when
Yeah.
we moved from local indigenous religions. And again, these religions, they weren't like, yeah, they're a big part of their life, but they didn't separate like religion, like you went to church on a Sunday. Like their whole way of living was just kind of intimately connected with understanding and appreciating things. So once things became institutionalized with dogma and written language is especially problematic because written language gives us the capacity to kind of say, we're putting words down now, and those words will always be the truth. Doesn't matter if they're written by like, ancient people 2,000 years ago living in the Mediterranean. Their same words then are relevant now. And that wouldn't happen in indigenous communities because when you don't have the written language, you're always evolving to your bioregion. So as your bioregion changes, you change, and your religion changes, right? All that changes as the landscape and nature changes. The written language has actually warped our capacity to adjust to time because now we're suddenly following these are words that are written that are holy. Even as the world changes around us, we kind of go back to those words written a long time ago, totally out of a different context from our own context. So yeah, so I think religion is clearly problematic, but written language is a big part of that issue.
All right. Let's see. We've got a busy chat, Jeremy. You're spurring a lot of thought.
That's the plan. That was
Yes,
the plan.
that was the plan. That was the plan. There was another one that I saw. Oh, okay. So I think it was again, Sat. I'm giving you. I know a lot, but Jeremy's giving his Buddhist-like advice on accepting impermanence. However, my question is, how does a doomerist philosophy affect the masses? Will we see more madness? He's very much into this whole, doom thing, and was like, he's given me ideas on shows, and I did a show all around his comments. I did a whole show around it. So,
Well,
what do you
I don't know,
think?
take again, don't know, right? But like take Dominica, right, which was totally destroyed by Hurricane, was it Maria? I think in 2017. I mean, completely different. Like people would show you pictures of the island, like almost literally not a single leaf on a tree.
Right.
And they got a little relief from outside, but not a lot. They mostly were just surviving off the resources of their land, and at least in that sense, they're beneficial. They don't have a winter, right? Because they can regularly eat off the land. But all the crops were destroyed when the storm hit, right? And it took a little while to build back. But there was no Mad Max on Dominica, right? It was just like people worked together. There was more communities pooling resources to find a way to live than there was killings and shootings. So like we have a kind of example of that collapse of a country, a small island country
Yeah.
that bounced back without Max. Now that's not saying that Mad Max isn't possible, but I don't think Mad Max is guaranteed because when we've seen collapses in history, that hasn't always equaled total mass chaos and destruction. So,
That's interesting.
but if Mad Max happens, right? Let's say Mad Max happens in 10 years, Mad Max happens in 10 years. There's no point getting all upset about it now, right? Like it's why the past is regret, the future is anxiety. But like I'm not a Buddhist, but I certainly have sympathies with the Buddhist outlook of appreciating the present moment is you do a little preparation, obviously, for the future. Maybe you're buying some canned food or you're learning how to eat plants in your yard. But like I used to have that before COVID. I was not a full blown prepper, but I was motivated to like I should learn how to eat the plants in my yard because if the supermarkets run out of food, I better know how to eat plants in my yard, right? But now it's not about learning how to eat plants in my yard so I can survive. It's like, no, it's kind of cool. It's like interesting to be able to be like, oh, that's like purslane and spotted spurge. They look very similar, right? But actually one's poisonous and one's very healthy. And you can tell because you break them open and you see the poisonous sap, and the
Mm-hmm.
spotted spurge has like the red dot on it. So it's just kind of interesting to know that and learn that, and then to know I can kind of save money and it's better for the environment. I didn't need fossil fuels because I'm just eating weeds in my backyard. But it's even though I'm doing the same thing, I'm learning how to eat local plants in my
Yes.
bioregion. The motivation totally shifted from, man, I better learn this skill because hard times are coming, versus no, it's kind of nice to know. I like that I can do that and I can share that with people and tell that to people, and then it might have some benefit when there's no more food in the supermarkets, right?
And
I say
there's a
some, not
lot of people on our channel that are gardeners, and
yeah,
we
yeah, yeah,
are doing a
definitely.
lot of this together. And we like to do gardening shows, and I like to have people send their pictures and show their gardens because it's not all about me. It's
Right.
about you guys. All right, let's see here. There was something that was good I wanted to find in my questions. Oh boy. And it wasn't you, Sat, even though I have 100 million questions from you. All right. Well, here's a little. So, how would Jeremy see a perfect society?
Well, I'm
Which,
reminded of the book Utopia. It actually translates as no place, and that was intentional, right? There's no perfect society because there are no perfect beings, and societies will always corrupt if they're based by non-perfect beings. But if I can answer, I don't know, one of the best possible societies, um, yeah, it's a society where more of us are getting relationship with natural environments as much as possible. I know there's some people don't like to get their hands dirty or they hate the bugs, although they don't have to worry about that because there's not many bugs left. Um, but
oh,
I
there's some
think
bugs here.
what's that?
There's bugs here.
Yeah, but
Hmm.
right, but
Lightning
less over
bugs.
time, right?
I know, I know,
Yeah.
I know.
But yeah, I think the more people have more of their lives invested in their specific bioregion, like actually spending time and learning about it and teaching about it and working with it and growing your own food, and just studying nature and listening to birds, that and systems and structures that facilitate it, like education facilitating that, and policy facilitating that, right? Like like stop building unnecessary buildings. Definitely don't build another building, right? I don't think we need a single more building, right? Like maybe you can make a few more energy efficient buildings, possibly. I don't know, eco design buildings, but generally we have enough buildings for all our purposes.
Yeah, we
So stop
do.
forests. Stop destroying the
Stop building.
forests so that we can, yeah, appreciate what we still
Okay,
have.
Gary. Let's see, Gary. Any ideas about grid down situations actually altering people's points of view and water hydropower drying up in USA South Southwest? Maybe people will listen to science more and ancient prejudice less. What do you think? Any ideas about grid down situations? Hmm.
Yeah, again, I think of Dominica, right? Like they very much had a grid
Like I
down
said,
situation, and they got through it. Now I know it's the best example because there still was a functioning global industrial society around, right? So there still could fly in supplies, and you still could flee the country and go to a place that did have running water and electricity, etc. But I think, yeah, I don't know. There's 8 billion humans, and I think we're all going to act very differently when things start to fall apart and the grid goes down. I think some will be utter depressed, anxiety, panic, and make very selfish decisions based in fear. Some will find themselves suddenly a lot more giving and caring and nurturing, and that they now have a purpose, right? Like before they were like serving their pointless industrial job, and now they're actually doing things that matter. So yeah, I see the whole spectrum of humanity acting in very different ways. I can only hope the more we're collapse aware earlier on, the more people, which is why it's great we're doing on this channel, and all the
Collapse
people on your
aware.
channel who talk about it,
Yeah.
gets themselves kind of prepared for it, both actually in terms of, learning how to adapt, but also just accepting the letting go of this society that's going away. The more that we do that, we can't prevent collapse, obviously, but we can make the adjustment more hard rather than horror, would be my hope, if I'm allowed to say that, Sam. I'm just going to say,
Yeah.
Sam's going
Well,
to come at me. Sam's
I
going to
would
come at me.
say right now my life is a little hard, but not hard at all compared to what it could be.
Right.
But it is no longer horror.
Right. Yes. We are so far
No
avoiding the
horror.
horror.
Oh, hi, Mark Roche. He's he's with us, and hi, Groot, and let's see, Kim. I know there's some going back and forth between Kinky Streets and the moderators, but Kim is really good people. So guys, we have to accept each other for who we are, okay, and get along. We all. What is it? Why can't we all just get along? We have to get along, guys. This is supposed to be a loving you know a loving chat, and we all should accept the things we can't change about each other, because we can't change each other. We can respect each other's viewpoint, and that's what I've always wanted to happen on this channel and in the chat. And sometimes it goes a little awry, but so be it. Human beings, that's why we're human beings, right? That's why we're so fucked, basically. All right. So Gary again has to absolutely foreclose on the future is the essence of hubris or overweening pride. Things will get very difficult, right? Maybe we will go extinct, but we make a way for life as best as we can. And that is a really nice statement.
Yeah, I'm fully on board with that sentiment for sure.
I am as well. I am as well. All right, so let's see, guys. We've been an hour and a half. Shit, this,
Wow.
jeez, I know. I never
Shows are
expected
getting longer and longer.
Wow, they do. They just do. All right, guys. Let me see how you are doing out in the chat. I think we've done pretty good here. Uh, Yes, Melanie. Melanie wants to contact me through Facebook. Yes, yes, yes. You could do that. All right. So everybody listen. Donald's here. I want to say hi to Donald. We follow a show in the morning that I really do like. It's a young gal named Andrea. And well, I want to say thank you. And we didn't even do an environmental coffee house flush of the
Oh, right.
day.
So,
My
yeah,
gosh,
what do we
I'm going
flush?
to ask you, what would you, if you wanted to flush something away, it's your choice. I want to hear what your
Uh,
choice would be to flush.
I would love to flush away Elon Musk. Yeah.
You know what? Do you know how many times Elon Musk has been flushed on this channel? But I
I
will
know, but
flush.
he
Okay,
deserves
we're
one more
gonna.
because he's still around. You have to sometimes just keep flushing. Keep flushing.
Oh my God. All right, guys. Even in a drought, that flush didn't
Right.
cost me
It's
any water.
it's a worthy use of water, even in a drought.
Yeah, I'm telling you guys, I'm using my outhouse because it's a bucket like Sam has. It's a
Oh,
bucket with sawdust. And if I don't want to use the water, I don't have to. So,
well, actually, it
anyway.
could be also like a Japanese flush because I don't know, like traveling in Japan, like
Yeah.
if you haven't ever been in a Japanese toilet bowl, I mean, now they kind of have them here, but they're amazing. They have these they have like music and a bidet you can adjust, but they also have like the sound of a flush so that you don't waste water if you don't want people hearing your bathroom sounds.
No
But it just
kidding.
makes the sound so it covers up your noises. So
Wow.
yeah,
No, I didn't
yeah,
know that. I just
yeah.
remember in China that that the flushes, when my folks went to China, they came home and they told me that it was when they first went, and my boss too, that they just go to the bathroom, it's a hole in the stall,
Yeah. Oh,
and that
yeah.
a lot of things were not like they are in America,
Oh yeah. And, well, China now, man, like having just been there 2019, like the cities in China, like I mean, it's not sustainable. Like these grand cities look pretty cool, but they're monstrous and they won't be able to exist in some decades. But
No,
they've come a long way, certainly as far as industrial development goes. They're like
I,
really It's way more advanced than our cities are in many ways.
I have a question about that, actually. Is it true, since you were there in 2019, and my stepbrother's married to a Chinese gal, and his son also married a Chinese gal, and I forget what city they're from, but they both got married in China, that there are these phantom cities, these big built up
The ghost
cities.
cities, yeah.
Yeah, tell us. Do you know much about that?
Yeah, I've seen them. So I taught at the University of Xi'an one summer, and then we went to Bateau, which is actually where they do a lot of the mining for the rare earth minerals for a lot of technology is in Bateau and near there. But we drove on a bus from Xi'an to Bateau. I forgot, it was a couple hours. But I remember it was like a late bus. And I wondered if it was not intentional, right? Because most people were like sleeping. But I was just very curious. I wanted to say, what did it look like? And we drove past them. These like whole cities full of apartment buildings that may or may not have lights on, but there's just nothing there. Like, it's just completely abandoned. And part of it's like the real estate boom is so huge that a lot of people, like, the way you invest in China is you buy property. Even if it's a place you don't live in, you just buy an apartment in a random town because there's fueling so much with construction. And Sam talked about this a lot, right? Like, there's more construction poured in the last 3 years in China or every 3 years of the century than there has in all the US in the 20th century. So yeah, they're just building these massive buildings and no one's living in them. And it's like, what a horrible waste of resources. But it's all that whole constructive system.
Wow. Well, this has been a very interesting show. I've enjoyed myself. For the most part, I know the chat has enjoyed themselves. They are a randy bunch of chatters. Absolutely, definitely a very, very busy group of chatters. I love you all, guys. And it seems to me like that person that really got under my skin has gone. I guess
Sandy went all attack dog.
Well, you know what? He was a troll, and he was an obnoxious pain in the ass fucking asshole. Sorry.
Okay,
but, we get those people.
Don't let him get to you, Sandy. Don't let him get to you.
I'll have to edit this if you want to use this video. Sorry, I forgot. I was gonna behave myself. Oh my. Okay, I can always edit out the cursing, right? All right. Well, everybody, thank you. Don't forget, Jennifer and I will be doing our usual Sunday show, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you aren't, and don't forget our fundraiser, Buy Me a Coffee. It's just one of those things that keeps the channel going. We are not monetized, so we don't get found through the algorithms. It is word of mouth and my marketing, of the channel. Trulia, Fat Boy, Kim, thank you. Jin, Realize, hello, Realize. John says, tell us what do I really think? Okay. And, lightning round. May we all pray to our techno lord, Elon Musk now. We already got through that one. All right, everybody. Thank you, Jordan. Great job, Jeremy. Good testimony. Nice work as usual. Sandy, thanks. Chatters, nods to mods. Rocking the apocalypse. Yeah, we are rocking the apocalypse. And I will then say good night.
Thank you all for commenting. Sandy, great job as usual. And maybe I'll see you in a couple days.
I hope so. That would be cool. All right, guys. All right, here we go. Here.
Still there, Sandy?